They were raised in church, baptized as children, attended youth group every Wednesday, went on mission trips, memorized Bible verses, sang worship songs. Their parents never missed a Sunday. And then they turned 18, graduated high school, and disappeared. By age 23, nearly 40% of Gen Z who grew up in church no longer attend. By 30, that number climbs higher. This isn't gradual decline. This is exodus. They're not joining different churches. They're not switching denominations. They're leaving Christianity altogether. The most church generation in youth is becoming the most unchurched generation in adulthood. Youth pastors are bewildered. Parents are heartbroken. Church leaders are scrambling for answers. Because this isn't just about empty pews. It's about a generation that watched everything their parents' faith promised and decided they want no part of it. This is Gen Z born between 1997 and 2012, and they're walking away from church at rates never seen before in American history. The question isn't whether it's happening. The question is why. And if we're honest enough to listen to their answers, what we'll hear might challenge everything we thought we knew about faith, church, and what it means to follow Jesus in the 21st century. If you ask Gen Z why they're leaving church, one word comes up more than any other: hypocrisy. They grew up hearing that Christianity was about love, grace, compassion, and serving others. Then they watched the adults in their churches vote for politicians who separated immigrant families. They watched church members post hateful comments about gay people online. They watched their youth pastor preach about purity, while rumors swirled about his inappropriate relationships with students. One 22-year-old former church member described it this way: "I remember sitting in church on Sunday listening to a sermon about loving your neighbor, and then on Monday at school, the same people from youth group would bully the gay kid. They'd make racist jokes. They'd gossip viciously about other students. And I just thought, if this is what Christianity produces, I don't want it." Gen Z has a finely tuned hypocrisy detector. They grew up on social media where everyone's contradictions are public. They learned early to spot the gap between what people say and what they do, and they've watched that gap become a chasm in the church. They heard about loving enemies while watching Christians celebrate cruelty toward political opponents. They learned about humility while watching pastors build personal empires. They were taught that faith and politics shouldn't mix, then watched their churches become essentially Republican organizing spaces. Previous generations might have tolerated or overlooked hypocrisy in the church. They'd say, "Well, nobody's perfect," or "We're all sinners." But Gen Z doesn't give that pass. They expect alignment between values and actions. They expect authenticity. And when they don't see it, especially from people claiming moral authority, they walk away. This isn't about Gen Z being judgmental or unreasonable. It's about them taking Christian teachings seriously, perhaps more seriously than the generation that taught them. When Jesus said, "You'll know his followers by their love," Gen Z looked around their churches and asked, "Where's the love?" When they couldn't find satisfactory answers, they left. The 2016 and 2020 elections accelerated this. Watching 80% of white evangelicals support candidates whose behavior contradicted everything they'd been taught about Christian character created a crisis of faith for many young people. A 24-year-old who's currently deconstructing his faith explained, "I was taught that character matters, that integrity matters, that how you treat people matters. And then I watched my church completely abandon those principles for political power. It felt like everything I'd been taught was a lie. Like Christianity was just tribalism with a religious veneer." This is the authenticity crisis. Gen Z isn't leaving because the church is too strict or too demanding. They're leaving because it's not demanding enough. Not of its own members, not of its leaders, not of itself. They're leaving because they see a gap between what the church says and what the church does, and they refuse to pretend that gap doesn't exist. The second major reason Gen Z is leaving the church can be summed up in 3 letters: LGBTQ. Gen Z is the most pro-LGBTQ generation in American history. More than 70% support same-sex marriage. About 20% identify as LGBTQ themselves, double the rate of millennials. They have gay friends, trans classmates, bisexual siblings. LGBTQ people aren't abstract theological concepts to them. They're people they love. And they've watched the church treat those people with judgment, exclusion, and sometimes cruelty. One young woman who left her evangelical church at 22 shared her experience. My best friend came out as gay when we were 16, and I watched how our church responded. Not with love or compassion, but with condemnation. They told him he was choosing sin, that he needed to change, that God couldn't accept him as he was. He left the church. And honestly, so did I, because I realized if the church couldn't love my friend, it didn't represent the Jesus I believed in. This isn't just about theology or biblical interpretation. It's about human dignity and belonging. Gen Z grew up in a world that increasingly affirms LGBTQ people. They learned in school about diversity and inclusion. They saw gay marriage legalized. They watched trans people tell their stories. Then they went to church and heard that all of that was wrong, that being gay was sinful, that trans people were confused or deceived, that affirming LGBTQ identities meant rejecting biblical truth. Many Gen Z Christians found themselves in an impossible position: stay in a church that condemns people they love, or leave to maintain their integrity and compassion. The church faces a profound generational divide on LGBTQ issues. Older generations were raised in a culture where homosexuality was stigmatized and hidden. For them, traditional sexual ethics feel like obvious biblical truth. But Gen Z was raised in a very different culture. For them, excluding LGBTQ people feels like obvious injustice. And many of them are choosing justice over tradition. Some churches have become affirming, fully welcoming LGBTQ members and even ordaining LGBTQ clergy. But these are still a minority, especially in evangelical and conservative circles where Gen Z was often raised. Most churches maintain traditional teachings, and most Gen Z members either conform in silence or leave. The data is stark. Among Gen Z who identify as LGBTQ themselves, church attendance rates are extremely low. But even among straight Gen Z, the church's treatment of LGBTQ people is a major factor in their departure. One straight young man explained his decision to leave. "I'm straight, but I couldn't stay in a church that told my gay cousin he was an abomination. I couldn't participate in a community that would reject him. So I had to choose between my church and my family. I chose my family." This represents a fundamental values conflict. Gen Z values inclusion, acceptance, and affirmation of diverse identities. Many churches value biblical authority and traditional sexual ethics. When these values collide, Gen Z is choosing inclusion, even if it means leaving their faith behind. There's a third factor driving Gen Z away from church, and it's more subtle: the church's discomfort with questions and doubt. Gen Z grew up with the internet. They have access to every perspective, every critique, every alternative worldview at their fingertips. They've read atheist arguments. They've studied other religions. They've encountered biblical scholarship that challenges traditional interpretations. They've seen the diversity of Christian beliefs across denominations and cultures. And they have questions. Lots of questions. What about evolution? What about other religions? What about contradictions in the Bible? What about the problem of suffering? What about hell? Does a loving God really torture people forever? What about biblical commands that seem obviously wrong today, like slavery or subjugation of women? These aren't hypothetical questions for Gen Z. They're urgent, pressing concerns that affect whether Christianity makes sense in the modern world. A former youth group member described her experience. "I started asking questions in youth group, like, how do we know the Bible is true? What about people who never heard about Jesus? Why does the Bible seem to condone slavery?" And the answers I got were basically, "You just have to have faith," or "Don't let Satan plant seeds of doubt." They treated my questions like they were dangerous instead of legitimate. Many churches, especially conservative ones, operate on a model of certainty. They teach that the Bible is clear, that Christian doctrine is settled, that doubt is a sign of weak faith. Questions are often seen as threats to faith rather than paths toward deeper understanding. But Gen Z doesn't do certainty well. They've grown up in a complex, pluralistic world. They're comfortable with ambiguity, with both / and, rather than either / or. They want to wrestle with hard questions, not receive pat answers. Gen Z has what we call an epistemological humility, a recognition that knowledge is complex and no one has all the answers. They're skeptical of anyone who claims absolute certainty, especially on complicated issues. So when churches present themselves as having all the answers with no room for questions, Gen Z sees that as arrogant, not faithful. This creates a painful dynamic. Young people ask genuine questions, seeking to deepen their faith, but their questions are met with defensiveness, dismissal, or accusation. They're told to just believe, to have more faith, to stop letting the world corrupt their thinking. Eventually, many stop asking questions in church. They start asking them elsewhere, in online forums, in college classrooms, in conversations with non-Christian friends. And often, the answers they find outside church are more thoughtful, more honest, more intellectually satisfying than what they heard inside. One young person reflected on this experience. I had more honest, nuanced conversations about faith and doubt with my atheist philosophy professor than I ever had with my youth pastor. The professor took my questions seriously. He didn't try to convert me. He just engaged with the ideas honestly. And I thought, if atheists can handle these questions better than Christians can, what does that say about Christianity? Some churches have learned to embrace questions and doubt as part of faith. They've created spaces where young people can wrestle with hard issues without fear of judgment. They've acknowledged that faith can include uncertainty, that following Jesus doesn't require checking your brain at the door. But many churches haven't made that shift. They're still operating on a model that worked for previous generations. A model of clear answers, unquestioned authority, and boundaries between sacred and secular knowledge. For Gen Z, that model doesn't work. And rather than pretend it does, they're leaving. Finally, Gen Z is leaving because they see the church as captive to culture, specifically to white, middle-class, conservative American culture. They grew up in the most diverse generation in American history. They have friends from different races, religions, and backgrounds. They're comfortable with diversity and global perspectives. They value social justice, environmental stewardship, and systemic change. Then they look at American Christianity and see something that often feels narrow, tribal, and culturally captive. A young woman who recently left her church described it this way: "The Christianity I grew up with felt like it was more about being a good American than being like Jesus. It was about supporting the military, respecting authority, achieving the American dream. Issues like racism, poverty, and environmental destruction were barely mentioned. But personal sins, especially sexual ones, were constantly emphasized." Gen Z has watched American Christianity largely fail to address the issues they care most about: racial justice, climate change, economic inequality, immigration, mass incarceration. These are moral issues to Gen Z, but many churches either ignore them or take positions Gen Z finds morally wrong. Meanwhile, issues that don't resonate with Gen Z, like fighting against gay marriage or maintaining prayer in schools, are treated as the most important battles. There's a profound disconnect between what Gen Z sees as urgent moral issues and what the church emphasizes. Gen Z looks at climate change and sees an existential threat requiring immediate action. Many churches either deny climate change or treat it as unimportant compared to personal morality issues. That disconnect makes the church seem irrelevant at best, morally bankrupt at worst. Gen Z also sees racial injustice differently than older generations. They grew up learning about systemic racism, microaggressions, and white privilege. When they bring these concerns to church, they often encounter resistance, dismissal, or outright hostility. Watching white churches fail to address police brutality, watching Christian leaders defend Confederate monuments, watching Sunday morning remain the most segregated hour in America. All of this tells Gen Z that the church isn't serious about justice. One young person expressed his frustration. After George Floyd was murdered, I wanted my church to say something, to do something, to acknowledge that Black lives matter. But instead, they were silent. Or worse, they defended the police and criticized the protesters. I realized my church cared more about order and comfort than justice. And I couldn't stay. This isn't about Gen Z being too political or too woke. It's about them taking seriously the biblical call to justice, to caring for the oppressed, to being peacemakers. When they see churches failing to embody those values or actively opposing them, they conclude that the church has lost its way. So why is Gen Z leaving the church? Because they see hypocrisy and demand authenticity. Because they value inclusion and the church practices exclusion. Because they have questions and the church demands certainty. Because they care about justice and the church seems captive to culture. But here's what's important. Gen Z isn't leaving because they hate Christianity. Many are leaving because they love what Jesus taught and can't find it reflected in the church. They're not abandoning faith because they're shallow or rebellious. They're leaving because they took their faith seriously and found the church wanting. This is both a crisis and an opportunity. A crisis because the church is losing an entire generation. An opportunity because Gen Z is telling us exactly what they need. Authenticity, inclusion, space for questions, and commitment to justice. Some churches are listening. They're creating communities where doubt is welcome, where LGBTQ people are affirmed, where justice is pursued, where questions lead to deeper faith rather than judgment. These churches are retaining young people not by watering down faith but by taking it seriously in new ways. But many churches aren't listening. They're blaming Gen Z for being too sensitive, too worldly, too influenced by culture. They're doubling down on positions that push young people away, convinced that faithfulness means never changing. Gen Z is leaving. The only question is whether the church will ask why and actually listen to the answer. Because if we can't hear what this generation is telling us, we won't just lose them. We'll lose the opportunity to become what they need us to be, a community that actually looks like Jesus. The exodus is happening. What the church does next will determine whether it's permanent.